Now, in World War One, being a British service member, there are levels to the jobs that you can be in. And there are hundreds of different jobs throughout the war. You can be a policeman on the home front, and your entire job is to just police your little hometown because maybe you're not fit enough to go fight in the war. And that is objectively better than having to move all the way down to London to be a postal worker for the entire war. And that's objectively better than being a merchant marine guy that runs constantly from France to the UK. And that's objectively better than the next thing, and the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, and then eventually boils down to being just a standard infantryman. Well, we are going to look at what was the worst combat job on the Western Front, so Belgium and France. Now we're going to specifically look at cavalry, aviation, infantry, and tankers. There are a bunch of other jobs that were also incredibly bad. Like if you want to really look at the naval side of it, being a submariner for the British Navy was one of the worst possible jobs. I mean, I'd rank it higher than some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. If you really want to look at the Navy, we can see being stationed in Africa as a Navy guy would suck as well. But we're just going to look at the Western Front. So we're going to look at cavalry first. So cavalry in World War I is kind of relearning its spot in war. Since the invention of the pike, horses kind of lose their efficiency, but then you armor the horses, and then it's a little bit better, and then something else gets made, and it's an arms race like every other piece of technology. But once the rifle comes out, horses really kind of feel the hurt because you can harm the horses way before they touch you. And then once you have repeating rifles that can fire 6 shots in a minute, well, now the horses really have to reconsider who they attack. And then the machine gun comes out, and now they really have to switch up how they do things because a single machine gun can turn back a cavalry charge by itself. So 10 years before the war, the British are fighting in Africa, and you see this happen. A large British cavalry charge on a supposedly numerically inferior and technologically inferior enemy happens, and the enemy turns back the British cavalry with significant casualties. So by World War I, the British have kind of redefined how they use horses, and they come up with 3 major uses, and that is going to be recon, charges of disoriented enemies, and the exploitations of retreats and gaps. The guy in the photo here is wearing a gas mask with his horse, and this would be taken later in the war. But really, during World War I, they don't get used for those roles in the sense that they had imagined pre-World War I, because World War I wasn't expected by anybody. So we're going to talk about that now. So I couldn't really figure out how to incorporate this video's drawing, so I'm really just doing this out of the love of the game at this point. But the first thing that the cavalry would be used for would be recon. So if you're trying to protect the village and somewhere outside the walls of the village of the enemy, you could send out horses in every single direction, like a happy little son, and figure out where they are. And it's fast, it is accurate, and the horse finds the enemy up here, realizes, yep, they're there now, and then turns around and runs as fast as it can back home. That's the first use. And in World War I, it does get to see a recon use pretty well, especially early on in the war. At the Battle of Mons in 1914, before trenches were set up, recon is used very extensively, and it's very effective. Now, air units are kind of taking over recon for the horses, but not fully. It's more like a hand-in-hand situation, because a horse can give extremely fast and precise, pieces of information to whoever needs it, but it's very localized, small groups. A plane can give very, very wide angles of recon, much deeper into the enemy's lines, but it takes a significant amount of time for that plane to get set up to go on that recon mission. The commander says, I want a horse to go figure out where the enemy is. And then he relays that message to one person. And that person goes and tells, the guy that's in charge of the horses, hey, go figure out where this is. And the guy on the horse goes and he figures out where it is. He goes back to his commanding officer. He says, here's where the enemy are. That guy goes back to the other guy and he says, here's where the enemy are. And then that guy goes to his commanding officer and says, hey, commanding officer, that's where the enemy is. Well, in a plane, you have the commanding officer and he says, I want to know where the enemy are. And then that guy the commanding officer tells his aide to go tell the next guy, to go tell the next guy, and then that has to get relayed to an airfield. And at the airfield, they have to draw up a plan for this. And then they have to brief the pilots. And then the pilots have to have good weather. And then the pilots can go up and they can take a photo of it. And then they have to fly back. And then they have to go develop the film. And then after they develop the film, they have to give it back to the commander. Then they have to go back to the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy. And then it goes back to the commander, where he then looks at the information, tells the next guy, who tells the next guy, who briefs the troops on what's happening. And it is this long thing. So cavalry does have a use. It's just not exactly what it used to be recon-wise. All right, next up on our super epic drawing, cavalry charges. In World War I at the Battle of Mons, cavalry is used very effectively in a major charge against German positions. Now, it was effective solely because they were discombobulated like these guys. When the enemy is spread out and they are not focusing their fire, and the infantry comes in, they can pick off each individual person one by one by one by one. And it works. It works great. But when the enemy is lined up like this, and they are all focusing their fire, by the time the horses make it to here, all of these guys have already fired a handful of times. So they have to break up the enemy. Well, trench warfare is more like this and a lot less like this. So after the Battle of Mons, you have the Race to the Sea, and the cavalry is used to plug gaps in different, lines, the exploitation of retreats and gaps. And it plugs the line, it's very fast, it's effective. But once the trenches are set up after the Race to the Sea, you have that concentrated amount of infantry, and the horses can't do their jobs anymore. So they spend a lot of 1915 sitting in rear areas as generals kind of figure out, what are we going to do with these horses? So they get a lot of 1915 off. And then towards the middle of 1915, they get put in just dismounted cavalry roles. They get treated as just regular infantry. And that's kind of it for them for most of the war. They just become standard infantry troops. Well, in 1917, the Germans retreat back to the Hindenburg Line, and the British are left wondering, Jerry over there has been in the same spot for 2.5 years. Why is he suddenly not there? So they call it the cavalry. And the cavalry comes in and they get to do fast recon. And they do this fast recon to go figure out where the Germans are. And they figure out where they are. And then they go back to being just standard infantry for, most of the remainder of the war until 1918. And then in 1918, the German army is in shambles, massive retreats across most of the fronts. And the cavalry get called back up to exploit the gaps and the lines in the, German lines. And it's great. It's wonderful. You get a whole lot of this, not a lot of this. And you have more cavalry charges in the final months of the war. And this goes out really well. And cavalry end the war with significantly less casualties than pretty much any other unit. If you were a cavalryman, your odds of dying or being injured are significantly less than the standard infantryman. So of the 4 choices, if you had to pick one, you would go cavalry. So, go cavalry. Now, aviation in World War I is very new. 9 years old at the start of the war new. We make a plane. We go, this is pretty cool. We should make more of these. And 8 years later, somebody's like, let's put a gun on it. And let's kill people with it. And then the rest is history. But in World War I, you have people learning to fly. And it is a very respectful front. On the ground, lots of savage fighting, but in the air, if your plane is obviously out of the fight, you are obviously injured, the enemy on several different occasions would let you leave. They would let you go back to your side, or they would escort you to their lines and then force you in a landing, like the scene from Charlie Brown and the Great Pumpkin. But they wouldn't just outright finish you off. That doesn't mean that they weren't trying to kill you. In 1914, you had pilots throwing bricks at each other if they didn't have guns, because love of the game, I guess. But a lot of the danger in aviation, World War I, would come from the training, not the enemy. Some training accounts in World War I have the death toll as high as 90% of all casualties, which is shocking. Now, again, this is in 1914, and newer sources have the amount of all the deaths from 1914 and 1915 in the Royal Air Force being at about 50%. But even then, that's not much better. 50% of all people that go into training die or get seriously hurt to the point that they can't fight anymore just from training. I mean, training is as low as 20 hours in 1914 before they get shipped off to the front. And then even in 1918, it's still only about 75 to 100 hours of training. And the people that are training them in 1914 only have around 35 hours. I mean, there are several cases of somebody completing their training, then they, are supposed to be sent out to the front, but for whatever reason they don't get sent out to the front, and then they just start training the new batch of people, even though they were just trained. And it leads to training accidents all over the place. There are reports that I saw online of this guy riding home, and he was talking about watching one of his, squad mates go up in the air, go inverted, and then fall out of the plane because he never buckled up his seatbelt. Click it or ticket, I don't know. And that would just happen. And then by the end of the war, training accidents were a lot lower, but still, a lot of accidents happened and deaths because of training. Shockingly high. Now, the other thing that is causing a lot of these deaths is how the planes were made. Now, look at this plane on the screen here. This is a extremely early plane from World War I. Except you have two people sitting in the very nose of the aircraft. You can see there are two little spots, and there's nothing protecting them. They're not even in an enclosed space. And this is because, again, planes were only made 9 years earlier. They have no clue how these suckers fly yet. Like, the mystery of really why things are happening is not entirely known yet. So people are going up in these completely wooden aircraft covered in cloth. There is no metal because the engines are not powerful enough to support fully metal aircraft yet, and the fuel tanks are also unprotected. So you get shot at by the Germans, your fuel tank gets punctured, and at best your fuel leaks out and you make a forced landing because you have no fuel, and at worst it catches fire. And the entire plane goes up in flames because there is no protective measures in the slightest. And then you also don't have a parachute, so hopefully you are already low to the ground so you can make a forced landing, or maybe you're higher up in the air, and in that case, well, it ain't looking too great for you. But after you are done flying, you live a good life. You fly for a couple hours each week, and then you come back to base and you live in a nice wooden barracks with 3 hot meals, and you get showers, and you get recreation time, and you get leave, and everything's happy and dandy. It's just when you go fly, you could be one of the 1 in 4 Royal Air Force pilots to die during the war. 25% almost died throughout the entire war, and that is an incredibly high number. But you don't have a day-to-day constant scarring experience like the infantry does. So is it better to have almost a 25% fatality rate on the high end, but then once you are done doing that activity that has that high fatality rate, you go back home and you live a good life? Or is it better to have a comparatively low death rate, but you are in a much more intense environment for a comparatively much longer period of time? And that's really for you to decide. But I have this ranked as number 2 in terms of like best to worst. So next we're going to talk about the infantrymen. Now, the infantrymen quite possibly could be the worst job of the entire war. I have this ranked number 3 because I think tanks slightly edge them out for just the worst job possible. The infantryman sees the most amount of death out of any of these jobs. And that would be because there is more infantrymen than any other job at the time. There are more casualties in the infantry because there are more infantry. It's there. That's it. But you are not seeing as high of a death rate as the aviators. Your death rate as a standard infantryman is somewhere around the 8 to 10 range, depending on which sources you use. But 8 to 10 is a lot less than 20 to 25 like the aviators. So based off of that, you would say that the aviators are infinitely worse. But once you account for injuries that get reported, and then you tack that with the death rate, that jumps up to 60 to 65%. Well, now 65% injured and dead is a lot higher than 25% on the high end dead of aviators. And that also doesn't include, PTSD. That doesn't include, not being able to sleep afterwards. It doesn't include 100,000 different things. It doesn't include the hearing loss that you might get later in your life. It could be 100 different things. But let's say it's 65%. They account for everybody that has complications after the war. That's still, you walk into a room with 3 people and 2 of them are either dead or wounded, and that is an incredibly high number. Now, also, going on with this 60 to 65% wounded and dead rate, they are living in just constant horrible conditions compared to the aviators that, after they're done with their mission, live in nice conditions. That's why I have infantry higher on the list in terms of how bad they are. Like this guy in this photograph here, he is standing guard in his trench, waiting for an attack. And you can see people sleeping in the backgrounds. You can see people going about their day in the backgrounds. Except that is that guy's entire reality for a week at a time on the front, and then 2 weeks in the support trench, and then 3 weeks in the reserve trench, and then he gets a couple weeks off, in the back lines. But that's his life. There's nothing he can do about it. Once the artillery starts firing on those front trenches, there's nothing he can do except sit there and hope that the artillery doesn't land next to him. The aviator goes up and he flies, and for 5 hours he has that same worry, but then he comes back and he lands and he's fine until he takes back off again. But this guy has no control, and he has to sit there with the mud and the disease and the rats and the cold and all these other things that make his life just that much worse. That's why I have him, that much higher on the list compared to aviation. Also, one of the other less talked about things is that infantry regiments were formed up entirely from singular towns. You have entire regiments of people that sign up at the same time from the same area, and then when somebody gets killed, it's not, oh, the guy in our unit died and I never knew his name. It's the guy that lived 2 houses down from me died today. And that hits a lot harder than just, some random person they never talked to. And it is just absolutely horrible to think about what the standard infantryman had to go through, let alone being a machine gunner as an infantryman or an officer, because they had much higher casualty rates compared to just a normal infantryman. There are levels to this, and it's just even worse. Now, the one thing that slightly redeems the infantry compared to aviation is that depending on where you are and when you were there, the job can be better or worse. If you are near Ypres in any point of the war, it is possibly the worst spot you can be in. If you are near the Swiss border for pretty much any part of the war, you are in a lot better of a spot. And then, everything in between. But it just depends on when and where you are in different positions that can make or break it to being the absolute worst job to being somewhat tolerable. And yeah, but there's still one job that is worse than the infantryman, and that would be undeniably being in a tank. Now, being in a tank in modern day is still not a reportedly good experience. It's fun. You have a 120mm cannon that can annihilate anything that it wants. You can run over anything you want. You will not be stopped by anything. You are a metal beast that can roam around the battlefield as much as it wants. But in World War I, it's completely different. They are as far away from something as you'd want to be and as humanly possible. And in 1916, the first tanks roll out on the battlefield and just show how bad being in a tank could be. It is hot, it is cramped, and everything in that tank is trying to kill you somehow, some way. So, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, 50 tanks are ordered to participate in the attack. 50 of them. And only 25 actually make it to their start positions. And of the 25 that make it to their start positions, only 15 actually make it to no man's land. And of the 15 that make it to no man's land, only a handful actually make it to their objectives. And of the handful that make it to their objectives, only a handful of those actually manage to make it through the rest of the battle. It is absolutely abysmal trying to be a tanker at the Battle of the Somme, and then really any battle afterwards. It's just not a good time to be in them. And that is for a handful of different reasons. One of them is that you would lead the attack. You would always be at the very front and center of an attack. And this means that all fire is directed on you. You are the target. You are the easily identifiable, massive multi-ton target rolling across the battlefield. And artillery would see this, and they would target you specifically. You are slow enough and you are big enough that they can accurately hit you, and so help you if one of those artillery pieces gets hit. That's it. You're done. Also, you will get stuck anywhere, because you are that large and mud will just disappear from under you. So even if you do make it across no man's land, which the odds are against you, even if you make it to the enemy, the odds that you survive the artillery and then manage to keep out of the mud after you've engaged the enemy is extremely low, and it's just not a place you'd want to be in. Now, look at this photograph on screen here. This is a cutaway image of what the inside of a tank would look like. And it is as far from humanly possible what you would want to be in as you can imagine. Now, this is a male tank, as noted by the two 6-inch, massive guns that are on the side of it. Female tanks would carry machine guns. Well, those ammo racks are completely exposed inside of that tank, and the armor is not that thick. So if you have an artillery piece that happens to land inside of the tank, not only is that artillery still going to explode and probably kill everybody in the tank, but the ammo will cook off, and then you're really in trouble. Or maybe one of the rounds manages to rattle out of its position and fall to the floor, and then you're really in trouble. There could be 1,000 things that go wrong with that ammo, and that's it. Game's over. Also, if you look inside of it, you can see the pistons from the engine toward the back. And those are completely exposed gears moving around. If something gets caught, you're done. You're injured, you're out. Nothing more. And that is just horrible. So the gears are trying to kill you. The ammo is trying to kill you. The temperature inside of the tank is trying to kill you. Tanks could reportedly get up to 120 degrees, which is mind-blowing temperatures. Because also keep in mind, these people are from Britain. Half of them haven't seen the sun. They see clouds. And then they get put in this metal box of 120 degrees. People are falling left and right. Also, the ability to get a gas leak inside of a tank should be studied. Gas leaks were all too common inside of tanks during World War I, and a lot of crews would go out that way without even knowing it, because gas leaks just happen that often. You get shot by a standard rifle round on the side of the tank, and it punches through the armor, and it hits a gas valve and opens it up just enough for the gas to start leaking through, and everything in the tank is gone. And maybe, a rifle round hits the front of the tank, and it doesn't, go through the tank, but it sends little metal shards flying throughout the entire tank, and you get hit by the metal shard, and well, now you're blind. That's it. So being in a tank is just horrible. Now, the casualty rates of tankers in World War I is comparable to that of aviators. It is around 20 to 25%, but they don't have the nice luxuries that the aviators had. They don't go back to nice wooden barracks where they, have nice meals. They just go behind the front lines a little ways, and they live in their tanks or near their tanks, and everything kind of revolves around that tank. And it really can be the worst possible job. Now, above all else, it really comes down to where you are fighting. If you're fighting in Ypres, in any role, it is going to be infinitely worse than fighting directly near the Swiss border in any role, just objectively. If you are fighting in Africa, chasing down what's left of a German army, that is going to be comparatively better than fighting at the first day of the Somme. And it really comes down to when and where you are being in this role. But not really a tanker. I really can't imagine a time where being a tanker would be enjoyable. Just 120 degrees, gas leaks, moving gears, just not enjoyable. So if anybody ever asks you what the worst job to be in as a British soldier on the Western Front, answer should be a tanker. And if it had across the entire war, including the Navy, then maybe submariners from the British Navy take that place. But land, it's a tank, it's not close. I don't want to hear any arguments about it. It's a tank. That's it. But they could make tea in their tanks. One of the first things that British tankers had in their tanks was a way to make tea. And that really just sums up Britain in a nutshell. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. See ya.